So I'll do my talk, and yeah. Well, anyway, I'm Derry Hannam, and for 30 years I was a teacher and a high school principal, school inspector in England, and then I worked for the Council of Europe and the UK government on citizenship and human rights programs. And this work confirmed my belief that if you want young people to understand democracy, they have to do it in the everyday life of the school and not just listen to teachers talk about it. And again, my work showed me that genuinely participative schools with really effective ways of involving young people in decision making actually exclude fewer people, more learning goes on, test scores are higher, not that I particularly believe in them as a measure, and attendance figures are much better. The most significant one is perhaps that there are far fewer exclusions in these more democratic state schools, which means to me that the kids are on the whole happier in those schools. Anyway, our state system in England right now is not in a very happy place, preoccupied with test scores, prescriptive curriculum, authoritarian hierarchical structures, league tables, and the levels of mental illness in young people are going up. And of course, all the additional problems of COVID and lockdowns on top of that. We have the unhappiest young people in Europe, in England. And we're even testing 3-year-olds, though we know its predictive value is almost useless. Though if you put kids on a slow table at the age of 3, they certainly learn that they're going to be slow learners, and that will have a lifelong effect on them. It's quite shocking. Young people are missing their friends during the pandemic, but I don't think very many are missing lessons where they've got no choice, no control, no consent over their learning. Coercion is normal. Many parents are struggling to force this curriculum on their children at home. And it's interesting, the research in Canada on parents' attitudes to the school curriculum since COVID, it's 73% of parents interviewed, and it was quite a large sample, several thousand, say that more attention should be given to the interests of the students in schools when they finally reopen. I think that's very interesting research. I had 2 guiding principles for my own work as a teacher, initially with younger secondary school students, 11 to 13, and then later with the full age range of secondary. Firstly, I believe that students should, wherever possible, and as much as possible, participate in decisions about their own learning, real self-directed and self-exploring learning around the interests and purposes of the kids themselves. And I shared Bruner's 3 C's of childhood. Children are naturally curious, collaborative, and they love to feel competent. And if you add to that Ken Robinson's creativity, that would make 4 C's. I'd be pretty happy with those. These qualities of childhood match those of Peter Gray of Boston College, who talks about the educational instincts of curiosity, sociability, planfulness he talks about, which is interesting, but above all, playfulness. And for me, play and creativity are closely linked. Maybe they're the same thing, or maybe one leads to the other. There's an academic at Cape Western Reserve University in the States called Sandra Russ, and her work shows that more imaginative play in young children correlates with enhanced creativity later on in life. I'm not sure about the ethics of some of her tests. If anyone knows more about her work than me, perhaps you'd like to comment. Her tests and measures seem a bit unethical to me. But anyway, my second principle, the first one, self-directed learning. The second one involves student participation in meaningful democratic decision-making in the everyday life of the class and the school in a human rights respecting community. And this in itself is a major source of learning about who you are as a person, about democracy, citizenship. It's a Vygotskian tool as a result. And it involves creating non-coercive spaces within our compulsory school systems. I call them pockets of democracy, where children of whatever age are treated with respect and capable of making many decisions for themselves and together. The conceptualization of a rights-respecting school began some years ago at Cape Breton University in Canada, actually, now being used in a few more enlightened parts of England. Well, the recent lockdown experience in England, where primary schools had too few children for age-based classes. The teachers were unable to use the formal curriculum. And they found that mixed-aged play with minimal teacher intervention has been wonderful for them to watch. Some of these teachers have never seen this before. Peter Gray's finding the same. He's doing some research in the States called play club research, where children are allowed free play for an hour in elementary schools, and the teachers are not to intervene unless there's a serious safety issue. When I was at school, learning about democracy and human rights was like reading holiday brochures in prison. I mean, there wasn't much point unless you were about to be released. And things haven't changed all that much, sadly, and in some respects, they've got worse. So I want to see public school systems everywhere move in the direction of more time for self-direction for all ages. A few systems like that in Norway or Finland are doing this already. I got away with a great deal as a teacher and as an acting high school principal. As I said, I've just written a book about it. I started teaching at a time when few secondary schools in England were trying to ease the transition from one teacher per class primary schools and the up to 10 subject teachers you get in secondary schools. But I was fortunate to find a school that was trying to ease that transition. And my first job as a humanities teacher was to teach English, history, geography, social studies, and religious education to one class of 34 11-year-olds for 60% of the school week. They just failed a very high stakes test in England called the 11 plus. 10% of the kids who passed it went to grammar schools with a real chance of going to university, and the rest went to secondary modern schools. So my kids had just failed this awful test. Few normally went on to university from this kind of school, though interestingly, quite a few kids I now know from my class did end up in university. Anyway, I joined a team of 7 teachers with a scheduled planning meeting. I was given my own large classroom. And this gave me what I call the 3 T's that I think are important to work in a self-directed way. In secondary school, anyway, you need time for lots of talk, for a class meeting, for students to become absorbed in what they're doing without bells ringing all the time and having to move to other rooms. The next T would be team, not to be on your own, especially if you're a young teacher just starting out, but to be with others and to share ideas. And the third T was territory, to have a dedicated space with display and storage, not moving from room to room to room. So that was a good start, and I spent 2 years with this class. Individuals and groups created their own projects in a democratic and rights-respecting class community. To my surprise, I know some of you heard me say this before, but to my surprise, instead of getting fired, I found tremendous support from parents. And in my second year, I was put in charge of a whole year group with 7 teachers who all opted into this project-based learning, 230 kids for 60% of their school week. Later, I moved to another school with a purpose-built humanities wing, and we did the same with grade 6 to 8 kids for 25% of their curriculum time. Not so much time, but enough to actually put the ideas into practice. I then moved on to be a vice principal of quite a big high school, which we proceeded to divide into 4 mini schools, each with its own team of teachers in mixed age advisory or tutor groups. And I was trying to move towards an integrated curriculum with a lot of self-direction in these mini schools. We made some progress, but we didn't get the whole way. Anyway, I'm a reluctant realist, and I recognize that a total reset of our school systems are unlikely to happen even with COVID. So what's my modest proposal? Well, it seems to me the crucial commodity that young people need in order to find and deepen their interests and identity and to learn how to live with others is time. They need time to think, time to wonder, time to question, time to create, time to hang out with their friends, time to find out who they are, relax, and just do nothing sometimes, and a space to do it in, like the kids in Sudbury schools or many democratic schools. Yet this is the one thing that prior to the virus, most state-funded secondary or high schools and increasingly middle primary or elementary schools as well, we deprive them of time. Lunch hours and playtimes or recess get shortened or cut altogether. The encroachment into free time, not just during the day, but at home in the evenings and at weekends with relentless homework, test, examination, revision. Formal learning and testing is introduced at younger and younger ages. We're doing it to 3-year-olds, for God's sake, now in England, telling them they've got to be school ready. Even in this time of coronavirus and school closure, many schools are aiming to teach tasks set online on a full-scale basis. The teachers are trying to teach regular lessons virtually. The tasks set are often basically just conventional schoolwork with conventional teacher talk from the screen instead of from the front of the classroom, followed by a conventional test. There's endless talk of children falling behind and the need for longer school days and shorter holidays so that kids can catch up. For heaven's sake, it's awful. Now, some parents are expecting and requiring this, but a growing number of parents are beginning to kick against it. There's a Danish parents organisation that's just produced a document saying, since the exams and mandatory learning goals are abandoned for now, as they have been in England, teachers report feeling more playful with students. They're working with co-creation, involving students in making decisions more than before. There's more quality time spent between teachers and students, resulting in better relationships and increased student well-being. This is happening in Norway as well, where they've completely rewritten the national curriculum in consultation with young people. It's much more democratic and student-directed, and they've used the lockdown time as a kind of transition time for the older, more formal curriculum into the new one. But it's certainly not happening in most countries and certainly not in mine. So the emphasis there is switching from teaching to learning, from prescribed content to inquiry, freed from the pressures of examination preparation, and a change in the quality of student-teacher relations to include more student participation and playful creativity. Well, shouldn't we be trying to make this happen in all our school systems? We know that it's perfectly possible to have a school system with high attainment that does not create pressure and anxiety. I mean, Finland, with its less is more, short school day, no homework at weekends at all, maximum 30 minutes any other day of the week. And that's legal in Finland. If a head teacher tries to set more homework than that, the kids can take the head teacher to court. And yet, despite this more relaxed approach in Finland and in Norway, these schools under the PISA league tables, which again I detest, I don't think they tell us that much, but even in the PISA league tables, countries like Norway and Finland are doing very well compared to the more authoritarian countries like mine. Anyway, when I was acting head of an English high school in the 80s, the 1980s, the students proposed that we should have activities days where they and the teachers would get together and create a wide program of activities which had nothing to do with the regular curriculum, which students of any age could choose any activity. The parents were supportive, so we did it. And the variety was amazing, as was the enthusiasm. It was very successful and very popular. So we extended it to a whole week at the end of every semester or English term. We had 3 activities weeks a year. The process of negotiating the program was itself very educational and led to much improved relationships between staff and students, much more use of first names, for example, of staff to students. And stakeholders from the local community came very involved in these activities weeks. I would say relationships were transformed and a lot of the kids changed their whole attitude to school because of it. At the point when I left the school, these activities weeks represented about 10% of the annual curriculum time. Nobody regarded it as time lost or wasted, and far from it. Disengaged students became engaged. Parallel to this development and closely associated with it was the emergence of my school as a community school with an elected community education council, usually chaired by a student. We had a community fair every year when all the organisations of the town would set up their shops and stalls inside the school, and the school resources would be offered for the use of the community. We ended up with adults in the school. The town library closed and moved its books into the school. We had adults learning languages in lessons alongside kids. We got rid of school uniform. Everything became more relaxed, but the kids became much better, changed the attitudes of some kids towards the teachers. They'd be very careful being rude to a teacher if their grandmother was sitting in the back of the class learning French. Anyway, each benefited enormously. And a number of entirely new organisations emerged, like a community newspaper edited by a team of adults and students. It's still running 40 years later. We had an orchestra with 100 players. The youngest was 7 and the oldest was 84. Didn't sound all that wonderful, but the spirit and life and the feeling of generation of being alive and doing something great was absolutely created in the school orchestra. We had a school jazz orchestra as well, which at one time had about 14 cello players. I think that's probably a record. Later, when I became an inspector, I particularly remember visiting, I went to 200 schools. Not all of them were particularly interesting, but one of them stuck in my mind in a rural area where many schools couldn't take part in extracurricular after school activities. Half the kids had to get on buses at the end of school. And the head teacher decided, along with the students' council and the parents' council, that they'd form an elective committee. And they'd use this committee to design half a day of the week when the school curriculum was just shut down. And all the activities, the extracurricular activities, moved into school curriculum time, and many new kinds of activities happened. This was half a day a week, 10% of curriculum time. Negotiated between staff and students. And if students wanted an activity that was beyond the expertise of anyone in the staff or any of the parents, the money saved by shutting down the normal curriculum for half a day a week more than paid to hire experts to come in and teach about anything that the kids wanted to learn about. The school was quite near a famous international motor racing circuit. And one bunch of kids and some parents and a couple of teachers actually built a racing car and took the blooming thing out on Silverstone racetrack. I have to say, under highly supervised health and safety conditions, but they built a car that actually worked. Incredible. It had very motivating effect on the kids. As in my school, the negotiations in this school between the students and the staff were themselves an education of a democracy, and through them relationships were transformed. Students of different ages could join any group they chose for half a day a week. Some of the groups were actually led by students themselves. There was a model railway group which built a beautiful model railway in one of the school cloakrooms that was entirely all the teaching was done by 2 or 3 kids who were absolute geniuses at building model railways. The program was very popular with all the groups. I talked to parents as an inspector, and several parents said to me, my kids would get off their deathbeds to go to school on electives day. And in fact, I checked the attendance figures for every day of the school week, and electives day had systematically better attendance than all the other days. I also checked the school's examination record, which was significantly better than you would have expected in a rural school like this. So here's my first modest proposal. I'm getting there in the end. All state-funded schools should be encouraged to allocate at least 10% of curriculum time to be negotiated around the interests of the students. Time for individual or collaborative self-directed education, with the teachers being available as facilitators or experts if their services were requested by the students. Sometimes the students could be facilitators or teachers. A teacher in my union magazine wrote last week that in her experience, kids already knew more about climate change issues than their teachers. 75% of English teachers feel unfit to teach climate change, but 65% of kids already have learned a lot and want to know a lot more and demanding changes in the curriculum. Anyway, as I've said, the negotiation process would be educational in itself, and the morale of everybody will rise. Results will improve, I would suggest, even conventional ones. Students will learn how to take responsibility for at least part of their own learning and learn how to manage at least part of their own time, both crucial if they're going to deal with the changes and uncertainties that the fourth industrial revolution is already presenting us with. We know that students from democratic schools like Sudbury Valley or Summerhill or Adira learn how to participate in managing communities while respecting human rights, and they learn to discover their own genius, identities, etc., rather than being defined by test scores. As paid employment declines and artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution move in, it will enable all kids to be unique, creative, socially responsible individuals, I would argue, who will not be relying on full-time paid work for their sense of identity. I mean, I think soon we're going to have to introduce some kind of universal basic income, but that's another discussion. And then I thought, well, okay, I was arguing for 10% of curriculum time to be devoted to student-directed learning. But why stop at 10%? It's such an untidy number. 20% sounds much nicer, a whole day. And then I began to discover that companies such as Semco in Brazil or the Scott Barter Commonwealth in England have for years used company training programs to encourage employees to widen and deepen their own learning in anything that interests them. More to the point, for more than 70 years, 3M has had a unique 15% culture that employees are encouraged to set aside a portion of their work time to pursue innovative ideas that they find interesting. And drawing on 3M's philosophy, Google has introduced its 20-time project, where employees are encouraged to follow their own ideas beyond their actual job descriptions for 20% of their paid work time. And for Google, this has led to some of their most profitable innovations. Gmail and AdSense were developed by employees not as part of their main work schedule. There's an American company you'll know more about than me called Target Project, which has opened up a similar scheme for all its employees with what it calls Orange Friday. So the transfer of the 20% idea from high-tech business world to education, well, it's just obvious, isn't it? And it is beginning to happen here and there. The mother of the CEO of YouTube, a woman called Esther Vajitsky, has been practicing 20% time for 40 years in a highly successful media arts program at Palo Alto High School. Students use 20% of their class time for totally self-directed projects. where their natural learning instinct takes flight individually or more usually collaboratively. And she uses the mnemonic trick: trust, respect, independence, collaboration, and kindness. Well, interesting to me that kindness is identified as key, though it's underrated, isn't it? It's a key human quality. I've just read a book by a Dutch guy called Rutger Bregman. It's called Humankind. And he argues that kindness has been crucial to our successful evolution as a species, rather than aggression or violence. Anyway, Vujicki's ideas run parallel to the 20-time movement, which I'm discovering is happening all over the US. It's a development of what you call golden hour. A very nice Vimeo film about it. And a guy called Kevin Brookhouse has just written a book called The 20-Time Project: How Educators Can Launch Google's formula for future-ready innovation. So my current modest proposal: all schools could and should introduce 20% principle tomorrow. 20% of curriculum time should be available for all children of all ages, ideally in mixed age groups, to practice self-directed learning around their own interests and passions. This could be one day a week, or 2 half days, or just 20% of the time within subject lessons. Much easier in elementary schools, of course, but entirely possible in secondary schools. Schools should create a 20% committee of staff and students to plan how the program would be organized. This would introduce the idea of students participating in serious school decision-making. A 20% department could be created, led by a teacher maybe of assistant principal status, and staffed by teachers from all subjects who wanted to work in this way. This would create a team of experienced self-directed learning facilitators in every school. It could have its own part of the school buildings, a 20% wing, if you will, where presentations of students' projects, where exhibitions, what are those things artists create, installations that would be open to the public. There'd need to be an entirely new approach to assessment, because currently we know the assessment tail wags the curriculum dog in most countries. We need a new approach to assessment based on processes rather than finished products. Failure would be something to be learned from and not to be feared. 20% of students of mixed ages would be in the 20% wing at any one time. Recently, the most boring magazine in the world, The Economist, it has a thing called its intelligence unit. It produces reports. The Economist Intelligence Unit has just produced a report called Staff 2030, the Future of Teacher Training. And it actually recommends, to my pleasure, that 20% of curriculum time should be made available for student-directed learning, claiming that the competencies developed are precisely those required for future workplaces, to produce autonomous learners and creators, which our current school system does not do. And it's ironic that the evolved nature of human childhood, as described by people like Bruner and Gray, of playful, creative, autonomous, yet collaborative young people, now aligns with the needs of progressive employers. Yet schools are stuck in the middle between the play of little kids and the requirements of employers. It's a crazy situation. Few schools are making the connection. So we need innovation, or moonshot time, where students are free to come up with their own ideas of what they want to do and study and how they want to do it. Your students will be future ready if you give them the time, says Esther Vujicki. The greatest gift we can give young people, and I know I'm talking to the converted here, but I had this paper prepared, so I'm reading the damn thing to you. Probably none of this is of any surprise to anybody here, but we have to stop filling every moment of school and at home with coercive curriculum. Well, they've realized this in Finland and Norway. How can we make it more generally accepted. And Zoe will tell me, yeah, well, you tell me, she'll say, because I've been banging my head against a brick wall in Greece for as long as I can remember to try and do exactly that. Anyway, this is now a proposal. I'd like to see the creation of more alternative democratic schools, of course, within large mainstream schools, schools within schools. These are beginning to happen, where parents can choose a school within a school that is almost totally self-directed. There's a history of such schools like Brookline High School and Scarsdale in the Boston area in the US. And we've got two schools like this happening now in England and one in Tallinn in Estonia, where a friend of mine, Charlie Moreno Romero, is principal of the school within a school. 70 kids within a regular high school of over 1,000. And the 70 kids are working as a self-directing community within a mainstream school. So that's what I hope would be a parallel change, the development of schools within schools, along with the 20% idea. So all around the world, we're seeing campaigns for change coming from young people themselves. I think this is very exciting. In the UK, we've got a group called Teach the Future, which is arguing for a more relevant climate change curriculum. It's actually organised school strikes inspired by Greta Thunberg, which upset some politicians, but have got others to begin to listen. And in Scotland, they're being taken seriously, unfortunately not in England. We've got another group in England very involved with Black Lives Matters called Pupil Power. This is largely ethnic kids from London. They recently shocked a bunch of head teachers. They pointed out that they'd read more books about education than the head teachers had. One girl quoted at length from Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and only 2 out of 40 head teachers had ever heard of Freire, but the kids knew about him. This is exciting. Recently, 400 kids met in a virtual conference called the YXY Conference, based in Palo Alto, again in California, where they discussed the issue, what if young people controlled their own school curriculum? That was exciting, 400 of them from all over the world. When Yakov Hecht and I, you know Yakov, the Israeli educator, we were at a conference in Strasbourg of 1,000 European educators, policymakers, etc., etc. And we suggested there the idea that 20% of school curriculum time should be allocated to the interests of the young people themselves. And Yakov asked for a vote. Overwhelmingly, these people who are in positions of power voted that this was a good idea, but they didn't go back to their countries and do anything about it, unfortunately. But they voted that it was a good idea. And there were 1 or 2 people who voted against it. And I asked them afterwards, why did you vote against that idea? And they said, because 20% is not enough. It should be more. So I thought, well, for heaven's sake, you know, why don't you go and do something about it? So I'm now trying to get a campaign together. It's possible, is it, that at last the natural learning potential of young people will get into alignment with the future employment requirements for collaborative and creative innovators, that the capacity of play seen in early years could develop from discovery to mastery without being squashed and distorted by a test-driven anxiety-inducing authoritarian school system. Well, I'm arguing that the 20% proposal is a foot in the door. And if we could once get that established, and it sounds reasonable, doesn't it? The state's still got 80%, for God's sake, to do its evil work. 20% it could part with. And I am finding politicians in England are beginning to say, when I talk to them about this, not all, for heaven's sake, some say, oh my God, no, we shouldn't cut the curriculum by 20%. We should add Saturday mornings for extra mathematics lessons. There are some who think that way, but I find the idea that sometime could be taken from the state curriculum, which is clearly failing for large numbers of kids. And of course, it's designed to fail. Our examination system in England is norm referenced. So it's designed to fail a third of kids in the name of high standards. Well, for heaven's sake, wouldn't it be reasonable to give those kids 1 day a week where they could do the things that they were interested in? So here we are. What do you think of the idea? How could you introduce it as a teacher, a student, a parent, or a voter? Is it worthwhile, or is it just a waste of breath? I've finished. Thank you incredibly. All the faces are still there, unless you put up stuffed dummies to look like yourselves. But I'll put this paper in the chat. Peter Berg's got a copy of it. If it's any use to you to argue the case, that'd be great. But what do you think? Is there any point in arguing for 20% time now in all schools?
Can I ask some clarification questions, please?
Go ahead, Zoe. Yeah, absolutely. We're such a large group, everybody can just jump in.
Maybe you said it already and I missed it. Is your proposal that this 20% be compulsory or optional is one part of the question. And the other is,
Brilliant.
how come you think it's worth fighting for a foot in the door which could be crushed by the 80% left in the power to crush the foot in the door?
Okay, first of all, is it compulsory? Here's one possibility, and you can tell me a better one. Here's one possibility. Everybody goes into the 20% wing for 1 day a week. But when they get there, they don't have to do self-directed learning. They can carry on. There'll be a maths teacher in the wing. There'll be a science teacher in the wing. There'll be teachers of all disciplines available. And the kid who wants to carry on having directed learning can find the specialist teacher they're particularly interested in and ask for lessons. And that's how it worked at AEROx school. When I visited Yakov school some years ago, kids could choose to have a more or less totally directed curriculum if they wanted to, but they could also choose not to. So what I'm trying to do with the 80% is at least create some time where kids who want to self-direct can self-direct. Now let's ask ourselves, what's likely to happen?
Sorry, can I interrupt? Because my question my question was maybe not what you understood. Are you proposing that this be compulsory for the schools, not for the students? That the school has to do this?
That's exactly it. It's to create space and time within the conventional curriculum for kids to self-direct their learning if they want to. I can see the absurdity of compulsory self-direction, but my experience of working in several schools myself, basically what I did was set up self-directed situations. So when I was in charge of the history, geography, RE, English and social studies curriculum, I had 60% of the time for a class of 11-year-olds and eventually for 7 classes of 12, 13-year-olds as they got older. The self-directed learning was possible for all of that 60% of the time. But because we had a team of 7 teachers, they provided series of lessons on topics that they thought the kids might be interested in. Sometimes they provided lessons on the actual compulsory school curriculum for that age. On the whole, the kids were pretty uninterested in that. But sometimes kids would ask for lessons by an expert teacher in a subject they were interested in, and that was absolutely part of the structure. So I was very interested when years later I visited Sudbury Valley School and found that's exactly what they did there, that when kids wanted lessons on a particular subject, they were provided. What they found at Sudbury, what Danny Greenberg and Mimsy told me was that they don't offer lessons, because what they found was if parents discovered there was some maths teaching going on, they'd press their kids to go to the maths lessons. I didn't find that when I was working in self-directed situations with an option to go to lessons in subjects if the kids wanted to. I found the opposite happened. There was a drift away from the subject teaching towards the self-direction. Very, very few kids after 2 years of being in a self-directed environment asked for formal lessons or formal worksheets. It gradually died out. And I think, if you like, this is why I believe in the foot in the door idea, that if we can get the idea and the experience of self-directedness for teachers as well as for kids, it will gradually spread through the school, and we'll end up with the 20% becoming 40%, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I might be totally wrong, and there might be some schools which try it and say this is rubbish and just throw it out and go back to 100% taught curriculum. But if we could get the foot in the door, we'd find out, wouldn't we? So that's the point of my campaign, to create some pilots and some experiments and see what happens.
Well, I'm one of those people who said, no, 20% is not enough, and really worries about how, the cultural impact of the rest of the 80%. But what you've been talking about is, it shows how that 20% changes even 10% seem to change the culture of the schools somewhat.
Yeah.
And it sounds like kids would have the opportunity to use that for tutoring if they needed it. And that could get parental buy-in. And one thing that strikes me about the whole proposal is, like, in Ontario, we had a very progressive report in the 60s that led to big changes in the school system that teachers and parents were not ready for. And it was very well researched. It was very developmentally appropriate. It had, but it was brought down, I think, because it was too much, too soon. The teachers were not prepared. The parents many parents were frightened. Many loved it. Like, lots of people loved it. But the 20% idea, and it gives teachers time to learn about this stuff themselves, and parents time to see their kids happy and wanting to go to school.
Well, that's my guess. I would hope that the 20% would be subversive and would gradually win more space and time. That is my experience. But it also produces opposition. So although you might create a 20% department and a team of teachers, again, as I say, my experience is that the 20% is a subversive force. But as it begins to win over more people in the school, the resistance movement can also grow. Yeah. So that puts a real responsibility on the school management. I don't think, when I created the team in my first job, it was 7 young teachers, and we more or less threw away the curriculum of the heads of the subject departments. Now, you'll know in secondary schools, the head of the English department is a pretty powerful character, and because they've usually got quite a team of teachers, they control quite a significant chunk of the schedule. And we largely ignored the requirements of the head of English. And he got more and more upset about this, especially when we moved the system, not just for the grade 6 kids, but for the grade 7 kids as well. He gradually saw his power base in the school being eroded. And I was very poor. I think my major self-criticism, I'm great at doing things with kids and inspiring teams of teachers who want to try something out, but I'm absolutely crap at communicating and converting those who are really worried about it or threatened by it. I'm really very bad at that. And I think that's where there's a role for school leadership, school management, to manage the overall situation. I mean, I
Yeah,
work with head teachers who let me get away with it, and probably they shouldn't. I don't know. Sorry.
yeah. So I mean, one of my concerns is like Diane Ravitch says you can't do the right thing till you stop doing the wrong thing, right? And our curriculum in Ontario is just so detailed and so developmentally inappropriate and so insane that I think the mentality here, if you introduce the 20% idea, would be, well, then they'll have to work twice as hard and have even more homework to cram all that vital curriculum into them in the remaining 4 days.
Well, there's no doubt it would be ridiculous to take 20% of the time and use it in a more creative way and still expect the old 100% to be dealt with in the 80% that's left. So there's got to be cuts in the mainstream curriculum. But I thought it was interesting, this study that showed that 73% of Canadian parents thought that the curriculum should reflect kids' interests much more than it does at present, and presumably a proportion of the sample were in Ontario. So I think haven't we got to use the momentum that's there now? Well, I can see it too in England.
I haven't seen that study. I need that study.
Okay. If you have a look on, you know, Heather McTaggart's got a website called Unschooling School.
Right.
If you have a look on the Unschooling School website, the study is there. Back to your point, Zoe, it was often said to me that kids can't cope with working in one kind of environment for some of the time and then switching to another environment. Now, again, that's not my experience. I had some crazy experiences in that light. In my democratic class of 11-year-olds had a law that if 5 people were finding the class too noisy, they'd put their hand up and minority rights should be respected. So there would be 4 minutes quiet, 4 minutes silence if 5 people found the room too noisy. And that worked fine in my class. They had a maths teacher who shouted at them all the time. And they got fed up with this as a class. So they decided, you know what happens when a teacher shouts at a class, the kids get noisier and noisier and noisier. And so the kids decided they would use their 5 minutes quiet rule in a maths lesson. So when the lesson got very noisy and the teacher started shouting, 5 people put their hands up and the class went completely quiet. The teacher then shouted at them, "Why have you gone quiet?" And nobody would reply, because if you talked in a quiet time, the class law said that if you talked 5 times in a week in a quiet time, you'd have to come before the class court and get some sort of chore in order to enforce the law. I thought it was fine if kids whispered in quiet times, but the kids didn't. They thought it was a major crime. And if we've got a law that you're quiet in quiet time, then you damn well should be quiet. Anyway, the class went quiet and the teacher got very upset. And eventually she found out this was Derry Hannam's bloody laws that the kids were using. And she complained to the union that I was undermining her class discipline because the kids went quiet and they were rude because they wouldn't tell her why they got quiet. And so I suppose, I mean, I was a bit upset with the kids. I said, come on, you shouldn't do this. These laws are just for my class. But the interesting thing was they took the law out of my class into the rest of their school time and tried to apply it there. It didn't work the other way around, and that the democratic self-governing methods actually became part of their thinking about how school ought to be. The thing was, of course, I had those kids for about 57% of the school week. Maybe 20% wouldn't be enough. And maybe you're right that if the kids are treated in a different way for 20%, the attitudes of the whole school would pervade the 20%. But again, my hope there that you might be wrong is I did it in a similar way in a school where we only had 25% for self-directed time. And that did gradually begin to spread through the whole school over the 3 years I was there. So I hope that's the case, that the direction of travel is for more, not less democracy and self-direction, once you get your foot in the door.
I understand the advantages of this approach, and I can see how it should and could lead to the most organic development into what maybe we have as a common vision towards much more freedom of choice. But the examples you're giving sound to me like pretty ideal situations. And what I'm worried about is something that, for example, we see a lot here in Greece, where these programs, the schools have to apply this program, so they have no choice. So they do, and it actually creates an even more, let's say, conflictual situation within the school, where the antagonism between the 80% and the 20% becomes very, very toxic. And I'm just worried about the situations where it doesn't work as a harmonious, organic transition into a natural evolution into how things should and could be according to the nature of learning, and it actually shoots itself in the foot in the door.
Suck it and see, Zoe, is all I can say. If you get a chance to persuade a school to give it a try, see what happens. It can't be worse than what's happening now. And I wrote a book about the development of the democracy with the 11 to 13-year-olds, because looking back on it, I think I was very lucky. I had a school principal who was willing to let this crazy guy go quite a long way. When I got opposition from unions, unfortunately, and also from some senior teachers, he tended to provide a safe space to work in. I was very interested to meet some teachers from schools in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago. There they have a network of charter schools called teacher-led schools. I don't know if you know about them. Very interesting. There were two. There was one in a place called Avalon, and another one was called the Minnesota Teacher-Directed School, I think, something like that. And these are non-hierarchical schools where the teacher team run the school. There's no principal, there's no vice principal, there are no heads of department. The school is run collaboratively by the teachers. And those schools were both highly participative for the students and very receptive to the ideas of young people. And it seems to me one of the problems in England, we don't treat teachers with respect. We don't give them any freedom to be creative. So in a way, it's not surprising that they've become the rather deadbeat, obedient force that they are. So maybe the teachers need 20% too.
If no one has anything else to ask, could you explain to us how this proposal combines with, if I'm remembering correctly, the European Council approving the 20% proposal 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, it was 4 years ago. The interesting thing, this was one of a series of conferences organized by the Council of Europe And as you know, the Council of Europe has no statutory powers at all. It has no power. It's a human rights organization, and it has no power to tell national governments what to do. And the European Union education is not, under the Maastricht Treaty, an area where the EU can tell national governments to do. It's totally within the power of state governments, what happens in their education systems. But the conference was interesting. It was to look at the connection between education and democracy. So perhaps the kind of policymakers and head teachers who chose to go to it were already people who were a bit interested in that area. But the support was overwhelming for the 20% idea. In fact, I think the support was overwhelming for the idea that the school curriculum should take much more note of the interests and enthusiasms and passions of young people. And the curriculum as currently constituted in most countries was a failure because of the number of kids who quickly disengaged, lost interest, or dropped out. This was happening right across the board. And the Council of Europe now, through a centre in Norway called the Wergeland Centre, is running projects in different countries trying to create more participative and democratic schools. And the Wergeland Centre does have a programme in Greece, Zoe, but I've no idea how successful it is or what the teachers make of it. But maybe if you have a look at the Wergeland Centre website, you could find out more about it.
But unfortunately, they were having the kind of problems that I described earlier with the application of the program in Greece.
Would anyone mind? I'd like to ask Derry a question that's a little off topic, but real timely. Just from all of your experience, Derry, what do you think students need to help them through this pandemic time? And what can be set aside in the current systems to focus on helping them to recover from the pandemic?
Wow. I mean, it sounds glib, doesn't it? But I think above all else, they seem to need each other. The sense of loneliness, and that kids say to me all the time, my own grandchildren, I don't miss school work, but I miss my friends, which just makes me feel that, of course, homeschoolers, real homeschoolers create social situations for their kids, and it's not a problem for them. But I think for lots and lots of parents who've suddenly been thrust into homeschooling, not from choice and not from any preparation, and not having any local networks of people who their kids can socialize with, for them, the isolation of the kids has been really a serious cause of lack of well-being in young people. So it seems to me to argue all the more that we should change the way schools work. And here we perhaps have an opportunity to point out that what the kids need is not more lessons, but they need more time with each other. And that message needs to be got across and got across and got across. And I think that's what I see as what's behind this Canadian research. I'm pretty sure we get the same results in England if we did something similar. That schools are not necessarily a bad thing in themselves, but we need to create more time and space within them for the kids to do their own thing. I suppose I'm just back to reading my paper again, but that's what I think my answer would be, Deb.
And do you have any sound bites, when I'm trying to talk to people about the concept of falling behind? It's one of my greatest, that, it enrages me.
Oh God, I'll tell you what comes straight into my mind is behind what? That's the first one. And the second one is so what?
That's what I say, but it doesn't work.
But the pet doesn't work. Okay, but the question behind what might
Yeah.
be interesting, because if what really worries them is that falling behind the others, well, the others are falling behind too. So that then leads to a discussion in, is the whole package that they're falling behind in, does it matter? And if they say, oh yes, they've got to get their education, then I'll tell you where the discussion goes for me. How much do you remember of school? And how much would it have mattered if you fell behind some of the stuff you did at school that has been completely useless in your life? Does it really matter if kids fall behind? The whole system needs opening up so that kids can make of it what they want. So I agree with you. It's very hard to have this kind of conversation, but I am hearing questions about, is it really necessary to make kids do quite so much busy work, especially around the idea of homework? When I tell parents here, who very often, even 7, 8, 9-year-olds have got a couple of hours homework to do every weekend, and I tell them that in Finland that would be illegal, their jaws drop a bit and they say, oh, well, they can't learn much in Finland then, can they? Don't those kids fall behind? And we all know that there was a time in PISA that Finland was absolutely the most productive education system in the world, along with South Korea. The conversations, it's possible to have those conversations, I think. We certainly should be having them.
Well, I'm gonna ask you another question then.
Go ahead.
Yeah, parents here are struggling at home. Our lockdown's going to go on for a little while longer, and so what can parents do to help their kids to sort of keep up their skills while they're at home without relying on this curriculum, which many of them are having problems with?
Now, I think an incredible range of games, videos, YouTubes, an incredible range of resources has appeared over the last 12 months, not least of which, of course, is OutSchool. Do you know about OutSchool?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's pretty good. I'm not sure if the guy is going to contribute to this AERO conference, but the guy who created it was at the last one, I think, and he was quite impressive.
Yeah.
They're really quite cheap, and kids can create their own. They have to get their parents to ask for them. But there's a vast range. Did he say there's something like 50,000 different programs now existing?
Wow.
In OutSchool? It's absolutely colossal. And it's everything from building a sailboat, to whatever it can go to. It's a vast range.
Okay, then again, as a longtime expert, like what aspects of curriculum, I'm thinking especially for the small kids, what aspect of these massive curriculums do you think needs most to be fought down?
The one that makes me angriest is the imposition of more and more formal learning at younger and younger ages. I've just been talking with 60 or 70 early years teachers in Turkey, where really I don't claim to have any expertise at all, but I'm becoming more and more interested in Reggio Emilia, etc., and the creative approaches. And seeing what's happening in my country is really upsetting, where formal learning is moving to younger and younger ages when we know it's exactly the opposite of what ought to be happening. So I think we've got to really fight the encroachment of phonics into the kindergarten, etc. And I think that many parents will be on your side there. And of course, the teachers, ironically, are on your side too. Something I find really upsetting is that teachers are willing to do things to kids that they know are harmful. There's a sort of a lack of professionalism about teachers that I feel we've got to do something about in teacher training. I had a bit of a discussion. Liz Campbell, who you may know, also from Canada, she teaches at Prince Edward Island University. And I had a session with about 50 of her education students who are about to go out for their second final practicum working in schools. And we were talking about this. What the hell should teachers do if they're told to do something that they feel in their bones is harmful? Well, what would a doctor do in that situation? And of course, the doctors all have this Hippocratic oath where they say they will do no harm. And I really think teachers need something like that. In Finland, of course, there is. I think it's called the Comenius Oath that teachers have to sign in Finland saying they will not knowingly do any harm to their students. I don't know if that's connected with the fact that Finland has one of the humanist systems, whether it's because the teachers have committed themselves in that way. I mean, another factor in Finland is that all the teachers are in one union, from kindergarten teachers right through to university professors. There's just one education union. And I think that gives everyone at every stage in the process a kind of commitment to all the other stages. So secondary teachers tend to have a good understanding of the needs of kindergarten teachers, et cetera, and the level of academic qualification. I'm not sure about this one. In my own experience, I'm not sure that the best qualified teachers have always been the best teachers. In fact, I can think of examples where the opposite is true. But to become a teacher in Finland is hard. There's a lot of competition. They're not particularly well paid, but they are well qualified.
That's an interesting one, because I know that's part of the Finland model is the deep respect for teachers as professionals and their agency as professionals and their high qualifications. But I know at Alpha, some of our most brilliant interns that just landed at the school and were immediately useful and did wonderful things with the kids. They couldn't get into teachers college.
Well, Bruno, I forget his second name. He's from Argentina, from the Argentine via Spain, now studying to be a teacher in Finland. He's worth talking to because he really thinks that I've got rose-colored spectacles as far as my perception of the Finnish system is concerned. He thinks it's pretty uncreative and teachers don't learn in training about the democratic schools. But the fact is, the system does do things that I wish were the case in England. For example, in England, the inspectors will not rank a school as outstanding unless the kids are divided up into so-called ability groups. We call it streaming in England. They're not allowed to give the highest grade to a school unless the school practices streaming. Go to Finland, and what do you find? Streaming is illegal. If a head teacher allows for any kind of discrimination by so-called ability or intelligence, he can be taken to court by any parent who chooses to take him there. It is actually illegal. The belief being that kids of all shapes and sizes learn from each other. And they're beginning to introduce much more mixed age teaching in Finland, not between 7 and 14-year-olds, but within age groups that are quite close together. They're also beginning to introduce more integration into the curriculum, project-based learning rather than subject-based learning. And all those are steps in the right direction as far as I'm concerned. And I think in terms of creativity and progressiveness, Norway has taken a major step past Finland in the last years. It's worth having a look online. You can find it all in English. The new Norwegian national curriculum and research done by Mary Ann Jones into the use that's been made by families and children of the lockdown time when schools were closed. They reopened again in Norway. But during the time that they were closed, the schools, through home teaching, prepared the kids for coming back to school to discover a new kind of curriculum at work where they were expected to take much more responsibility for their own learning. They actually used the lockdown time to prepare for the curriculum changes. And the research is very positive that it was successful, that it has the support of young people and parents. So it's worth having a look at what's going on in Norway. I do find it useful, even for the most bigoted right-wing politicians, if you can say to them, not only are things done differently in other countries, those countries are actually more successful. I mean, the level of well-being and happiness of young people, Norway and Denmark have the happiest kids in Europe. And I don't know about Greece, but I know that England is right down at the bottom of the pile. We have the unhappiest kids in Europe. And there are not many people who are prepared to defend that. You just need to use that information to change people's minds, to open their minds a bit.
Another thing I want to ask about is about competition and sociability. At Alpha, our kids, by the way, they naturally divided themselves into the age 4 to 9 and about age 9 to 12, and that's as far as we go. And so our groups are mixed age, and it's very hard for me to understand how anyone thinks kids can learn if they can't talk with each other. Our kids teach each other and help each other out all the time. And that's the ethic. And one of the amazing things that came out of that is that at Alpha, over the decades, there has usually been a little guy who ran around most of the time in the dress at any given time. This is just one example. The fact that we don't judge our kids means that kids don't judge each other. I don't recall comments ever being made about those little guys who would run around in the dresses.
Well, this is where my heart's coming from, Deb, as you know. But I've been stuck all my life in this state system. And in a way, I wish I'd pulled out 50 years ago and gone to work at Sudbury Valley, or if they'd have had me, or Summerhill. On the other hand, when I look back on it, I don't regret struggling away, trying to chip away at the system. It's not been a total waste of time. And I mean, just to make your own little space within it as a teacher and write a book about it, it seems worth trying. It's very interesting. I talk to, every time I meet Peter Gray, as I do from time to time, we were involved together on a project in Germany. When I first met Peter, I think it was 7 years ago in Bavaria. Oh no, it was at an AERO conference on Long Island University, 2013. He said, he came to my workshop, which was about transforming state schools. And he was very polite, you know, Peter, he was very polite, but absolutely scathing. He said, you're completely wasting your time. You know that, don't you? We've just got to take these systems to bits. They're completely and utterly hopeless. I met him a few days ago at the IDEC conference where he gave a lovely talk. His talks always are. And he was telling me about his work in state elementary schools in the US, where they're introducing this play hour. I mean, that's awful that you have to introduce a special time where play is allowed. Of course, that's awful. But he was actually doing this and then encouraging the teachers to see what happened when free play was allowed in the elementary school again. So I teased him about this. I said, are you actually saying that change is possible in the state schools, Peter? And he sort of laughed. But these are the systems we're up against. And it seems to me it's where most of the kids are. We've got to keep on trying.
Every kid is going through it. Every kid has to live out their time, and you can't wait. And when you just tear a system down, it doesn't help anybody. I know a lot of our kids in Toronto who are suffering the most in the lockdown. They're hungry because they're not at school. School provides all kinds of social supports. And I remember we had a panel back in the 60s that examined of sort of some of our leading lights of the time. And they said the school system was crap. And the only thing worse would be if there was nothing to have no place for kids to go that would make their world bigger than the ones their parents could give them. So that public school, I think is so necessary, especially in modern times when all the kids have is their apartment buildings in the streets, a lot of them.
Yeah.
No resources except the ones they can get through school.
Thanks for coming, folks, and keeping the discussion going.